Okay, chapter 36, Globalization, the very, very last chapter in your book, the end of the year, the end of the present era, or is it? We'll get to that at the very last point. Some basic trends and themes for us to get through, just to give you some closure on what we would consider to be history before we head into present day. So the first big theme is the end of the Cold War. Starting, depending on when you want to officially count it, starting in 1945 or 46, after World War II, Cold War will finally end in 1991. Now, some people look at the Cold War as ending at two different times. One being the actual destruction of the Berlin Wall, which actually begins in 1989. There's this big snafu with the East German government. One of their bureaucrats makes a public speech and kind of flubs one of the lines in which he was supposed to say that at some point in the future we will be opening up the checkpoints and the crossings to allow people from East Berlin to cross into West Berlin. The problem was he hadn't gotten enough clarification from his superiors as to when that change was going to take place and people would be allowed to cross. And so what ensues is one of the probably greater misunderstandings in modern history. And the people in the crowd in East Berlin take this to mean that the checkpoints are in fact actually open now. And so they swarm the checkpoints, the guarded gates between East and West Berlin. Thousands of East Berliners believing that they can now cross into West Berlin, and the few guards manning these checkpoints have this kind of moment of crisis. Do we hold our positions, and if these people get too rowdy, open fire? Or, and probably because they're also sympathetic, do we let them go? Even though we have gotten zero word that we are supposed to open these checkpoints. And they end up making the decision kind of on the fly to put down the guns and back away and open the gate. And thousands of people cross over into West Berlin that evening. And they climb up onto the walls and they dance and they pop champagne. And people grab pickaxes and sledgehammers and they start going to town on the wall that night, breaking off blocks and chunks of it. Now, the wall will not actually come completely down for another year or so, but some people look at that crossing and that initial destruction as more or less the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union just finally relaxing the last of their policies and just being like, you know what, we can't stop this anymore. But you see that flag coming down, that's the Soviet flag at the top of the Kremlin. That is coming down on Christmas Eve 1991, and that will officially commemorate the end of the Cold War, because when that flag comes down, the Soviet Union no longer exists, and it becomes the Republic, or the Federation, actually, of Russia. Alia?
Is that why they have a whole bunch of pictures that they have people staring on the wall?
Yep. Yep, and especially from the West Berlin side. But then once they realize they're not going to get shot, it starts happening on the East Berlin side too. People taking their little kids out and holding them up so people that are up on the wall can bring them up so that they can kind of become a part of this celebration. It's really a pretty powerful moment for people in Berlin. People that have been separated for 30 years are now finally able to reunite with friends and family on opposite sides that they may have seen very little or not at all in those previous 3 decades. Yes, sir?
Yeah. Weren't the soldiers guarding the checkpoints also amongst the first people to go across the wall?
In some cases, yeah. But again, I mean, consider your options. You got a mob of thousands of people coming at your little tiny checkpoint, and they're your own countrymen, and you as a guard may or may not agree with the policies of the Soviet Union. So in the end, in hindsight, it's not surprising, but in the moment, it was probably far more tense. So, quick question. Why does Russia decline? Why does the Soviet Union collapse? Your reading quiz gave you some of this already. We can really sum it up into 3 points. One of the problems is leadership. Once you get past Stalin and Khrushchev, the Communist Party, maybe you could say they saw the writing on the wall. They probably wouldn't admit to that. but they seem to do a great job of promoting mediocre people into positions of authority. People who won't rock the boat. People that will not upset the hierarchy in government, but people that aren't terribly good at their job. Now, communism as a philosophy was already seriously struggling to prove effective. When you then couple that with ineffective leaders, it really makes life difficult on this Soviet empire that they have carved out. Yes, sir?
Could you attribute the weakness and unwillingness to rock the boat of Soviet leaders after Stalin and Khrushchev to what Stalin had done before World War II, where he purged all his political enemies, even in his own party?
Well, some of it's attributable to Stalin, but some of it's just, it's the same issues that we've seen throughout history. The people at the top don't ever want to feel threatened and have the potential exist that they might lose power. So what's one of the best ways to not lose power? Make sure the people below you, next in line, suck and are never a viable option. So think back to like the Ottomans. The sultans wanted to make sure they weren't going to lose power. So what did they do? They killed all of their kids that might possibly rise up and rebel against them. And they kept the dumb ones around that wouldn't be a threat. You're seeing that same sort of thing play out here. You make sure the bureaucracy underneath you isn't as efficient as it could be. It preserves your power, but it weakens the overall structure. You see this sometimes in professional sports. You got like the one superstar with the giant ego who doesn't want anybody else around to threaten them. So what do? You build a weak team around them. You protect their ego, but the team doesn't really flourish. The other thing that begins to happen both internally within Russia and within the Eastern Bloc, civil unrest. Russia is, multi-ethnic doesn't even do it justice. Russia has so many ethnic and cultural and religious groups contained within that nation, within those political boundaries, that it became ever increasingly more difficult to make everybody happy. And usually the Soviet Union wasn't about making people happy anyway. It was about maintaining order and control. And they found more and more often the most effective way to do that is through harsh punishment and oppression and things like that. So if you're oppressing all different kinds of ethnic groups, sometimes trying to play one off of the other to keep the peace, what you're eventually going to create in the long term is a really unhappy situation where people don't like the government and they don't even necessarily like some of the other people that they have to share this country with. And so what will start to happen piece by piece is some of these ethnic groups will try to separate. Portions of the Eastern Bloc will rebel and revolt and pull away from the Soviet Union and demand their independence. Some of the ethnic groups within Russia will demand political changes and reform and greater rights and representation. Some of this, like I said, is religious. Russia has a fairly sizable Muslim minority population. There was a resurgent Eastern Orthodox portion of the population that had been clamped down on by the Communist Party because the Communist Party was all about obedience to the state. And if you're going to be obedient to the state, who can you not be obedient to? God. So you've got religious groups that are in conflict with the communist government, but also in conflict with each other. So basically, Russia is just tearing itself apart from the inside out. Alia?
What time period countries around Russia break off?
70s, 80s, 90s.
Was there a country that left Russia in the 70s?
Well, that's when the unrest is beginning. Most of that independence is going to happen in the 80s and 90s and into the 21st century. All right, and then the last and obviously kind of the biggest nail in the coffin for Russia is that they never got communism to the last step. They never were able to take communism to its desired conclusion, which is an end to all social classes and total equality in society. They were never able to get it there. And so you can only keep stringing people along with the promise of eventual equality for so long. And then if you don't get there after 4 decades of promises and oppression and sacrifice, people at some point are going to start to go, you know what? This isn't working. And then when you can look across the wall at West Berlin, or look across the border at West Germany, or look across the continent at any place in Western Europe and go, why is their life so much better? Not that it's perfect, but it sure looks a whole lot prettier than it does sitting right here. We want that. We're tired of this experiment. We want something different. Maybe it's not perfect, but it sure looks better. It becomes harder and harder for the Communist Party to defend communism. You're seeing the same thing happen in China today. China still maintains the ideology that they're communist, but in practice, there are more and more elements of open market and capitalism. They don't carry those names, but you see more and more elements of that in China as yet another example of all of the communist nations that have never been able to get to that final stage of, the true Marxist dream of total equality for everyone. It's never been able to play out that way.
What effect on Russia did we in the USA have? Did we have any real effect in their downfall?
Well, the United States' effect in their downfall is maintaining the Cold War. So when you look at Korean War, the Vietnam War, their war in Afghanistan, where we funded the resistance, the space race, the nuclear arms race, all the stuff in Cuba, like this got expensive. And so both countries' economies were severely burdened by this conflict. Resources that I'm sure in both countries they would have loved to have spent on industrial development or social services or whatever was being poured into these foreign conflicts, being poured into this technological development. And eventually, you just couldn't do it anymore. You just ran out of money. In the U.S., we like to talk about that, the notion of keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with your neighbors. Like your neighbor comes home with a brand new giant TV from Costco, and you're like, crap, I got to go get one now. Otherwise, she's going to come over to my house and be like, what's up with your TV? It's tiny. So you go to Costco and you buy a giant TV. So now you're even. But then he pulls into the driveway the next day with a new car. He's having the midlife crisis. He gets the Corvette, and you're like, crap, I can't be driving my Ford Taurus now. This looks lame. He's winning life. So you got to go have your midlife crisis much faster than you were planning to and go buy like a Viper or a Ferrari. Go down 28 to the dealership. Get a Lamborghini if you really want to impress him. Well, then he redoes his kitchen. Well, crap. I haven't touched mine since the house was built 40 years ago. So we got to upgrade that. Like, eventually, if you have this competitive mentality, somebody's going to run out of money. And that's part of what happens in the Cold War, is that the Soviet Union's economy, because communism wasn't effective, the Soviet economy isn't able to keep up with the United States economy. This does not mean, by the way, that we're blowing them out of the water and we just have piles of money. Like, we had serious economic issues too, and we had mini recessions, we had tax issues, we had all kinds of transitions back and forth between Republicans and Democrats because people in the U.S. were suffering at times. So this is by no means a blowout. It's not like we're just going along like, oh yeah, we got all this money, we're rolling around in our money, we have so much of it, we're burning it because we have some. No, like this is making our economy suffer and struggle as well. Ours was just a little bit stronger. So what this means in the end, Cold War over, flag down, Berlin Wall over. We're left with one superpower. We go back to the world wars, we had multiples. England, France, Italy, Germany. We had multiple superpowers. We get to the post-World War II age, we were down to two. The United States and the Soviet Union, polar opposites, and 40 plus years of world history are directly impacted because there were just two superpowers and they were diametrically opposed. Total opposites. We didn't blow them out of the water. We need to not do the rah-rah, America's the greatest ever, we've never had any problems thing.
No,
Not
we did
true.
create a weapon they couldn't counter.
What did we create that they couldn't counter?
We created missiles that could shoot down their missiles.
Yeah, we couldn't shoot them all down.
But we could shoot down a few, and that made we could shoot down enough to prevent certain damage.
Yeah, but there would still be plenty of damage if there was ever a nuclear exchange. By the time we get to 1970, the real threat of a nuclear exchange has more or less gone away. It's not anything that people are realistically worried about. The rhetoric and the posturing has pretty much gone away. We're past the point of we're going to blow you up. No, we're going to blow you up. Like, that's not really an issue anymore for the last 20 years of the Cold War. Now, with the end of the Cold War, though, and it just being the United States as the dominant superpower left, this causes some issues for the rest of the world. The upside is there's no more conflict. The downside is there's only the United States. And so this, in turn, creates new conflict. Because not everybody wants to do what the United States wants to do. And following the decline and the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States feels that they are now in a place to exert their influence on a global scale without the fear of competition and rivalry. And this leads us to do some things that, as especially more time passes and we're able to look back in hindsight, have been questionable, especially interventions in the Middle East. Now again, this is not to bash on America or raise the flag and be like, America's the best, USA, USA. But it's more to acknowledge the fact that in a world that only had a single superpower that could not be contended with, it caused kind of a resurgence of this imperialistic mindset of we can now go and do what we want, and when push comes to shove, nobody can stop us. They can, call us names, and they can criticize, and they can make their public political statements of we condemn this action by the United States, blah, 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 but they can't do anything about it. And so during this post-Cold War era, the world is out of balance because there is just this sole superpower. And as they said in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, and we haven't always been the most responsible with our superpowers. Yes, sir?
Didn't we intervene in the Middle East because some people from the countries we intervened in or supported from those countries rammed airplanes into buildings, killing thousands of Americans?
Okay, but you got to understand, a lot of this happened long before 9/11. There was 10 years between the end of the Cold War and 9/11.
Yeah, but we intervened in the Middle East. Once when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then we intervened when the Taliban attacked us on September 11th.
Right.
And when Saddam Hussein started doing more fist rounds, saber rounds.
Right.
And we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. He thought he had weapons of mass destruction too, but decided like it.
So again, the point is not to bash on America or go America is always right. It's to avoid both extremes and simply acknowledge that in a world with only one superpower, there is very, very little oversight. And because we have been strong enough to do things, we have often felt justified in doing things. Okay, other trends as we get into the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. Globalization. You saw that word in your reading quiz probably 4 or 5 times in 7 questions. So I'm hoping you got the point. I'm hoping you got the point that that's an important phrase for you to know. Now, economically, the world's been getting more and more globalized since like the 1600s. The Eastern Hemisphere discovers the Western Hemisphere. You actually get people traveling across oceans, trading with each other, sharing ideas, Columbian exchange, blah, 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 all that. But as you get into the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, technology has now ramped up to the point that we can share so much faster and so much more than we ever could. Whether it's with the internet, whether it's with travel, airplanes that can cross the Atlantic without stopping to refuel, whether it's super tankers that can carry thousands of tons of material across the oceans, whether it's the ability to interact via satellite or now internet with people on any other continent in the world, including Antarctica. This has allowed the distribution and dissemination of knowledge and culture and goods in a way that's never been possible before. Which is why you see McDonald's in so many parts of the world.
In Russia.
And it's why you see so many things here that have come from other countries, whether it's our cars or our appliances or our clothing or our literature or our movies or our music. It really has been something that the world prior to this point has never seen. It wasn't possible. Now, it's not often that we talk about the present in a history class, but one of the things that we mentioned to you before is that the whole purpose of studying history is to see what's happening now, figure out what we can do and what we should do, and then try to figure out what's happening in the future. It's just like you do in your life. You look back on the last 13, 14, 15, 16 years of existence, learn from your mistakes, learn from your successes, and make decisions today that will hopefully be beneficial. And then begin to plan for your future based on those past experiences. Now, not everyone has been thrilled with globalization. Not everybody is wild about the fact that other people's cultures are coming into their own. And I want to show you this just because it's funny. But going back to the Cold War era, this shows you that there was definitely some disagreement on this notion of global interaction. This is jokingly referred to, this was a political cartoon, of the world according to Ronald Reagan. It might be easier for you to read if you look at it later. We'll put it up on the vision page too if you want to take a closer look. But it's this very nationalistic view of the world. And so it's something that I want you to understand is still relevant and still ongoing. This notion of it's still my country first and my world second. Even as we have become more globalized and more interconnected, you at the same time, in many, many places, still see this issue of my country first. That same nationalism that sparked 2 world wars, that same nationalism that encouraged Europeans to cross oceans and colonize, that same nationalism is still around. It's been modernized. But that same notion of go us and boo everybody else is still around. Now, how does that then play out worldwide? Well, I mean, for those of you that actually pay attention to what's going on in the news, you see this all over the place. Not just terrorists, but you see it in the European Union. There's now a half dozen nations within Europe that want to break away from the European Union and go back to totally sovereign countries because they're valuing their national identity above this cooperative group. It's not good, bad, or otherwise. It's just acknowledging that you still have these 2 trends, this trend towards globalization and at the same time this trend towards nationalism. You see it in lots of developing countries. They want to develop and become like first world nations, but they want to do it while still being true to their culture. You still see it, I don't know, if you guys ever go on vacation, like anywhere that has a rich Native American history, not just in the US, but in Mexico and anywhere in Latin America, you still see this conflict where they're preserving the traditional culture. You can go to Chichen Itza outside Cancun in Mexico, and you can still see people that have learned the traditional Mayan dialect and that continue to wear the traditional Mayan costumes and still know the traditional dances and ceremonies. And they preserve that even as they take out their cell phone 5 minutes later to make a call to somebody in the US. This has become a very, very confusing time for people in the 21st century as traditional culture and modern culture are both available, and how do you make them both fit in your lifestyle? You continue to see some of the same trends that we've seen before. Some countries aren't happy with their progress, and they want to look backward to a time when they were great. We've seen this before. It's not a new thing. And for the people that don't study history, it seems like a new thing. Why are they doing that? That's so dumb, whatever. Or, hey, great idea. Why don't we do this? Nobody's ever done this before. So you see this return in some places to religious fundamentalism. And we're not just talking about Islam. The same is true in many Christian areas as well, or Buddhist, or Hindu. It is a natural human response that we've seen throughout history, that people revert to religious teachings, not in a bad way, but as a source of comfort and security in an uncertain future. You see it in traditional Christian communities here in the US. You see it in Muslim countries. You see it in Southeast Asia. You see it in South Asia. It's not a new thing. It's not a one group of people thing. It's a human response to change that we have seen time and again throughout history. Does it sometimes cause problems? Yes. Does it sometimes bring good things? Yes. Is there a hard and fast rule that religious fundamentalism is always bad? No. But when it's taken to extremes to the point of, causing damage to other people, then yeah, that's a bridge too far. Emily? Religious fundamentalism is when you go back to the fundamental root teachings of a religion, when you emphasize, especially in some cases, human interpretations of religion to kind of the nth degree, that will solve all of society's problems if only we hold to the strictest possible interpretation of a religion's teachings. Sometimes religious fundamentalism means that our religion is categorically correct, and anybody that doesn't believe it isn't just wrong or misguided, but a threat. And again, we've seen that. We saw it with the Crusades. Europeans reverted to religious fundamentalism, and they saw the Muslims in the Holy Land as a threat that needed to be eradicated in order for the world to come back into balance. Right. Alia? Right. Exactly. Neo-Confucianism. They bring that back. You completely, restrict women in order to improve the masculine portion of society and get that hierarchy back in place. So again, it's not a new thing. It's not a one group of people thing. We have seen it a lot. One of the things that we haven't seen, especially to this extent, is changes to the environment. Some of that is a product simply of population. Now, pretty much everybody is in agreement now that global warming is real. Yes, sir.
Actually, in September of last year, the British Met Office, which is the meteorological office, issued a report that showed that there had been a 0 net increase in the global temperature over the last 20 years.
Right. I'm not saying everybody's on board with it. I'm just saying that most scientific agencies from around the world.
And also it's been shown that some scientists who first came out with data, like the hockey stick you have over there, had either
What hockey stick?
You see the one right next to the polar bear? It's
This?
a hockey stick.
That's population.
Well, it's been also used as the global warming curve.
Yes.
Right.
So it shows they either had incorrect data or modified the data to build it.
Right. I'm not saying everybody's in total agreement on causes or effects or longevity. I'm just saying that most everybody has agreed that human beings have had an impact on the planet. Yeah.
What I said is that the idea of global warming is flawed and made up.
Well, like I said, not everybody is in total agreement yet. But come on back. Come on back. But as we have seen greater industrialization, especially as industrialization spreads outside of the Western world to developing nations in Latin America and Africa and Asia, we have seen changes in the planet. Not just global temperature, not just rising ocean levels, but in water quality, in air quality, the reason why you can't breathe in China today without a mask. Humans have, and I'm not debating the entire global climate change argument. I'm just saying that one of the trends that is developing in the present era is human impact on the environment has been greater than at any other point in history. I'm not politicizing it. I'm not saying one side is right or the other. I'm just saying that we have a pretty clear indication that more people and newer technology is having an impact on the environment, and that's causing people to change the way that they live. I am making no statement whatsoever about who is right and who is wrong. Alia? Oh yeah. Yeah, the smog in Los Angeles sucks. It's got nothing on Beijing, but it's still pretty awful.
Do you ever hear about the giant brown cloud? I don't know if it still exists anymore, but it used to be this giant cloud that was just hovering over a section of China and India. It was causing all the smoke they were putting off.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we talked about in the last two chapters. As developing countries are trying to develop, they can't follow the same path that Western nations did in the 17 and 1800s. They can't pollute the same way. They can't use fossil fuels the same way. They can't dump waste materials the same way, because we've now learned that that has a negative impact on the immediate environment. And so we still are having struggles with how to develop. There was actually, I don't know how many of you guys know of the website TED. It's all like scientific community, collaborative learning, all that kind of stuff. There's a 19-year-old physicist who built his own nuclear reactor. Kind of makes you wonder what you've been doing lately. But he has created a fission reactor that can be manufactured and mass-produced and provide 30 years worth of power by using weapons-grade plutonium, which we need to get rid of, and can provide power any place in the world by burying this thing in the ground so nobody can get to it, and it'll just churn out power for 30 years without needing to be refueled, without leaking, without anything.
So what are you doing in 30 years like that?
So basically, I'm 9-year-old.
You put another one in. Or in 30 years you use hydrogen, or whatever in 30 years is used. My point is,
What happens if we have some crazy guy-
just stop. That's why he built it the way that he did, so he can't, because he's actually doing counterterrorism with the government at 19. He's one of their experts. He's good at this. He's thought ahead. One of the things that this then changes is how developing countries develop so that they don't negatively impact their immediate environment. Again, going away from global warming, but dealing with immediate impacts on their environment. This is something that in the 1500s, nobody worried about. In the 900s, nobody worried about. In the 1800s, nobody worried about. This is a new trend that is changing the way that people live and interact on planet Earth. Yes. Because they recognize the changes. some people, and again, there's a wide variety of reasons. Some people have done it simply because of lifestyle reasons. Again, it's that looking backwards. Some of you, I'm guessing, have heard of the Paleo Diet. It's this new health craze. People are going back to like raw fruits and vegetables, basic meats, organic, but without any of the contaminants. So an oversimplified diet, nothing processed, nothing with preservatives, no red dye number 5 or anything like that. And then a simple physical exercise regimen that would involve like just basic lifting, basic running. Like you've seen the running shoes that have the 5 toes. Yeah. All right, that's part of that paleo movement of going back to the way that our old ancestors would have done thousands of years ago. So some of environmentalism is a desire just to do that, to go back to a simpler way of living. Some of it is based on modern science. Some of it falls someplace in between. So there's no one single driving force behind environmentalism. As with so many other things in history and in our society, it's always multifaceted. There's always multiple reasons that people do things. Is this a tirade or a question?
It's a question.
Okay.
Does the paleo diet involve using spears to hunt down wild animals?
I'm done with you. Okay. We also said that one of the greatest impacts on the planet is simply the number of people on it. This is a great visual of how many people. And it gives you a nice breakdown of how quickly we've gotten to that number. Now, we don't have great census data for all of human history. We do have pretty good census data for the last 100 years or so. And National Geographic did a great thing on reaching 7 billion, planet-wide last year. And so what this makes people wonder about, obviously, is what's coming in the future. And there's a lot of different opinions on it. Now, some is a straight linear model of continued growth. The UN, the US Census Bureau, all kinds of people have put out numbers, and those numbers do all kinds of fun things, like hit 7.5 billion and then whomp, go into like a 500 million nosedive. Some of them kind of level off somewhere around the 7 or 8 billion and do kind of a funny squiggly line. And some of them shoot up exponentially as you cross the 8 and then the 9 billion mark. Bottom line, nobody really knows what's going to happen, but it still raises a lot of the same questions of the planet doesn't change, it doesn't grow. What do you do with more and more people, and how does that impact not just the environment, but how does that impact societies? We've seen this time and again with civilizations. The larger you get, both in terms of physical size and in terms of number of people under your rule, the harder it becomes to sustain functional government. So again, it's not just the hippies are trying to get us to all go green, but it's how do you sustain civilization by learning from the lessons in the past.
Now, could you use the model of the civilization in the past, conquering another area, to apply it to nowadays, the growing population, where we could go and put people on another planet like Mars?
Well, and that's what some people are working on. And you've got companies like SpaceX, and even that 19-year-old physicist I told you about. He wants to take his fission reactor, put it on a rocket, and send it to Mars, where you would have 30 years of sustainable fission energy. So yeah, people are working on it as a solution to the increasing global population. Stop talking over me. So last thing to talk about. Throughout the year, we've been teaching you this history within defined periods. Foundations era, post-classical era, early modern era, present era. And we've also talked about periodization. How in the heck did we come up with those periods in the first place? Why are they divided along the dates that they are? It begs the question, are we in a new era already? Are we about to be in a new era? Could we have stopped the present era in the 1970s with the creation of the computer? Now that we can look back and see just how wide an impact that has had. There were people in the 70s that were like, yeah, this thing's never going to catch on. This is going to be a niche technology thing for people. It will not change the world. People said the same thing about the car. People said the same thing about the plane. People said the same thing about the radio. Like, there have always been doubters with each new technological innovation, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. But it also begs the question then, from a historical standpoint, as we're looking at trends and themes, have we reached a new period already?
Yeah.
Did we reach a new period with the internet?
Yeah.
Did we reach a new period with the current, cultural and political and religious issues that we're seeing today? Or is that merely a continuation of previous trends? Is the internet and television and cell phone communication really just tangible examples of a larger trend that started earlier of people being more interconnected? This is some of the work that history allows us to do, is it allows us to try to make sense of our present by looking at our past and then project for the future. Is it foolproof? No. Do we have any sort of perfect vision into the future because we study the past? No. Do you tend to get a better understanding if you have some sense of where you came from? Yes. So that was a portion of why we subjected you to all of this content. It's not that you have to know any of this to be a happy, functioning, successful adult in whatever field you choose to pursue. But it's simply that having a better understanding of where we as people came from, you can then potentially have a better understanding of where you are going and where everybody else may be going. So, with that said, last lecture over. It's been fun. Good job.